need to log in or anything up there?
Nah.
Well, we don't really, unless you want to look at our Dropbox full of assets, we don't really have anything to show.
No, probably not.
All right, so I'm Jeremy Barnes, and this is Jill Graves, and we did Heartland for the last 2 years. Last year, our Greywater game got the People's Choice and the Gallery Show and the Game Showcase awards, and so we decided that we wanted to come back to Heartland this year and do like the hackathon, or what it's the Code Jam now.
Code Jam.
Yeah, Code Jam is what it's called now. So we got our same team of 4 people that we had been working on Greywater with. You know, we knew that we worked well together as a team. We all got along, and so we were like, we should do the Code Jam. But before we sign up and make promises about having something to deliver and show to other human beings, we should first do a practice run. And so we did a practice run.
And we are so glad that we did.
Yeah.
Now you get to learn from that experience.
So we did a practice run, and it was a huge disaster, and we decided not to do the Code Jam. But we learned a few things. You know, you learn the most things from disasters.
You guys pull out of the Code Jam?
Yeah, we never signed up.
We never even registered.
We never even registered. We were playing it safe.
There's still 2 spots open.
Only 2?
Only 2.
That's good.
Wow. No. Yeah. So you learn the most things from a disaster, and we learned a lot of things, and so we came to share all of the wreckage with you. Oh man, there's so many things.
What theme did you pick?
So we did a practice run. We went to there's the Ludum Dare game jam that happens every year, and then they have lots of mini jams. And so we went and got all of their previous themes. I think they're on like 33 now. So we got the previous 33 themes.
Plus the 2 hackathon themes from the previous Heartlands.
Yeah, and put them in an Excel spreadsheet and generated one randomly from that. And I think what we ended up with was Alone, was the theme that it picked for us. And that was the first one, and so we went with it, and we started work on a little 2D platformy, side-scrolly type game. And we were pretty excited about the concept, and I still want to play around with it, and so we might. But we discovered a handful of things are required. First, you need to have, if you have more than one artist or illustrator or music type person, if you have more than one creative type person, you need a director of some sort who's going to make executive decisions about, you know, what size should sprite sheets be, and what size should assets be, and how many frames in a walk cycle. Because when you let the programmer make those decisions, he says things like 16 frames in the walk cycle, and then you get a walk cycle done and nothing else. You also probably need more than one programmer. I was the only programmer we had. There was me and Jill, who's an artist, and then my sister, who is an artist/music person, and then our friend Grace, who is an artist. And that's a pretty good makeup if you want to have a whole lot of art assets and not a lot of code. But if you're trying to build an entire game in less than 24 hours, one programmer is not enough. And especially not enough, and this is one of the more important things that I learned, and this really applies to every mistake that we made. Offload as much work as you can before the Code Jam happens. So we made a lot of basic mistakes, like Greywater does not have a proper physics engine because it's an isometric game, and if you use a physics engine in an isometric game, you're wasting yours and everybody else's time because all you need is tiles. So I took, you know, this 18-hour period that we had to learn Box 2D, which I had never used before, and I was like, I'm smart, I can learn things, I can learn how to use this new API in less than 18 hours and also build a game from it, and I was wrong. So I tried to learn Box 2D, and I got it working, and then we ran out of time. So you need to offload as much, learn whatever engine or framework you're going to use. I used libgdx because I like Java and I wanted to work in Java. And Java, you don't need a whole lot of performance for a side scroller, so Java was fine. So I knew libgdx's, like rendering pipeline and all of its like menu APIs and stuff, but I wasn't familiar with their implementation of Box2D, which is incomplete and has very little documentation. So having not learned those things beforehand meant that I had to reverse engineer old C++ code into Java code, and that's not fun, and that takes up a lot of time. So, if you can offload those learning processes beforehand, know your engine, know your framework, know all of the components that you're planning on using. If at all possible, build a crappy side scroller and build a crappy puzzler game so that you're sort of familiar with the basics of every genre that you might conceivably do in a code jam. Because you can make certain assumptions, like you're not going to build a fully functioning 3D first-person shooter in 24 hours, so you can rule out that genre entirely. But like, side-scrollers are pretty doable, and puzzlers are pretty doable, so if you learn how to make a really basic one of those, then the boilerplate you can make second nature, and you make that muscle memory, more or less, if you do it beforehand, because you have infinite prep time, and you can kind of cheat and use that infinite prep time to know how Box2D works and how OpenGL works beforehand, and then when you get to the 24-hour crunch time, everything sucks way less. You can also offload a lot of time, and this was a mistake that we made by like making dinner decisions. If you have a group of 4 people and you're trying to figure out, 8 hours in, we need food because no one can think because we're all hungry and now angry at each other. And then you all have to sort of stop working and talk. Do we want to go get pizza? No, everywhere's closed at this hour. Well, we can go and get Charlie Mitchell's open. We can go get burgers. Yeah, let's go get burgers. And then you end up in Charlie Mitchell's for like an hour and a half, and that's an hour and a half lost.
Plus the hour that it took to land on a decision on where to eat.
Right. So as if it's a weird idea, but if you can get everyone to commit to, we're going to have Pizza Hut, and we're going to have these pizzas, and we'll get them this many hours in. As much of that sort of nonsense that you can offload beforehand, and just make everyone promise to be fine with stuffed crust, then you don't have to set aside an hour and argue about it. And when everyone is hungry, you just get the thing off the list that you agreed to 7 days ago, and then that thinking is done, and you can continue working or whatever has doing. One of the problems that we had was because we didn't have any sort of like creative director. There was a lot of inconsistency in like we started playing with tiles, but we didn't know how big our tiles were going to be because we didn't know how big our character was going to be, and so and this goes back to learning your technology beforehand. We were trying to use the tiled map editor, which is the TMX format, which is a pretty good format, but Jill had never played with tiled before, and so she had to learn that on the fly, and she can tell you all about that experience.
Well, tiled obviously is a map engine that is made for making tiles, and the way that our setup was that I had just kind of been doing background art and just drawing everything in layers in Photoshop, and so trying to figure out like, well, what size should I break this up into was a little bit not the best thing to try to be doing on the fly.
Right.
And I tried playing. They have an object function where the objects are just floating without any tiles being broken up. But he couldn't figure out how to get that to work in the game. So I was like, man, I found this great solution. And then he's like, no, I can't get it to work.
Well, right, so for some reason libgdx implements a tiled map renderer, but they didn't implement the objects. So you can import as many objects as you like, and then libgdx will take them and throw them away. So half of the tiled map format, libgdx just ignores, and you can write that function yourself, but again, because I didn't know that they arbitrarily decided to leave that part of their API useless. I didn't know that until about 45 minutes after fiddling back and forth, like, are you sure that you've got the images set up right? Am I sure that I'm actually loading the images? And we found all that out. We found that we were loading everything correctly. We found that her images were formatted correctly, but the engine, for some reason, just didn't want to do it. So I had to learn how the engine's renderer worked and then use that same logic on objects. So I had to write part of the engine, which is not a good thing to be doing in a time crunch. We also had we had a little bit of trouble figuring out how like sleeping was going to work. If you try and work for 24 hours straight, really what you end up with is you get 18 hours of productivity and then 6-ish hours of staring angrily at a monitor and trying to do things and then deciding that what you've done is terrible and you have to undo it and redo it. So we had to find the balance between no sleep at all and be worthless for the last quarter of the project, and then Jill's strategy, which was sleep for 10 hours.
I did not sleep for 10 hours.
I think it was 12.
It was 6.
It was, yeah. So there's a balance that has to be found between no sleep and too much sleep, and like sleeping in shifts, because someone needs to be working at all times. But like if the person who's sort of fallen into the position of creative director is asleep, then it's hard for the other two artists to get anything done. We also had a little bit of trouble. Well, we had inconsistency, and this is, whenever you decide on, whenever you get your theme and you decide on like the concept of your game, everyone needs to sort of be on the same page for like you really have to have clarity of purpose, and that'll matter a lot more than how like smooth the game runs or how well animated it is. If the whole game feels like an integral piece, you can get past a lot of technical limitations. At the end of the day, design is more important than art or programming, so long as both of those things work. And we didn't have that because we were sort of making it up as we went along, and we hadn't put in enough planning. We were trying to figure out our technologies on the fly instead of figuring out exactly what the nature of the game was going to be. So when your programmer is focusing on making the most functional Box 2D implementation and the most functional tiled map rendering implementation possible, and then one of your artists is making 16 frames of bird walk animation, and the other one of your artists is in a fist fight with the tiled map editor, everyone's sort of on different pages, and when everyone sort of comes back and we take all the things that we have and we try and combine them, because there was no like team unity, we weren't all on the same page, you end up with things that all look pretty good and work pretty well, but when you try and combine them, it doesn't really work. Like maybe your character is too bright or your background is too dark, and like the art styles don't really mix, and the engine moves, like for a platformer especially, you don't want Earth real physics. Like falling at 9.81 meters per second is not fun. There's a reason we play games, and it's because Earth sucks. And so if you make the physics engine really realistic, that doesn't work with the stylized game that your artists have been creating. And if you have really realistic physics implementations for like friction and stuff, and you want to slide down hills, well now you can't, because things don't really slide that far because friction exists in the world. So you need to make sure everyone is talking constantly about this is the sort of game we're going to make. It's going to feel like this. It's going to look like this. More importantly than all of our assets need to be built around a 32 by 32 character. All of our assets need to be built around feeling this way and looking this way and using this color palette. And we're going for maybe the character is in our game the main character was a bird who at the beginning had a slightly ruined wing, and so at the beginning of the game you were supposed to movement was supposed to be sort of slow and laborious, but it didn't come through that way. It just came through that if you held forward, you went forward at a pretty good speed, and so we've got this bird with its really pained animation, and it's just speeding along, so you end up with this sort of weird contradictory feeling in the game. And by the time that you discover those things, if you're not communicating thoroughly throughout, it's too late. It becomes way too late to either make the bird animation look more cheerful or tweak every single way that the character moves and that the character interacts with the environment. And you can talk about sort of how the dynamics of the creative team have to work out, because I was not part of that because we didn't have any communication.
Right. We were kind of all just seated in our office, facing different directions. Nobody was really talking to each other. One person had headphones in. Probably not the best idea. And we didn't, I should have acted more as a creative director, like monitoring what everyone else was doing as they were doing it instead of like 8 hours in. So I think we mentioned a couple times we had this absolutely beautiful, smooth bird walk animation that was 16 frames, but it did take literally the entire time, and our artist, one of our artists was just entirely devoted to that for the entire length of time, and like I was trying to do backgrounds and stuff, and the styles were pretty cohesive because we had talked about that ahead of time, but it was just like I needed to manage her and be like, no, you can cut that down to 6 frames and save a lot of time. I think 6 is probably just about the basic level, the lowest you can get. You could probably do like a 4 if you're doing like pixel art, but for anything more complex than that, I think 6 is a good number to aim for. I do think that we just got a little ambitious.
Yeah.
Definitely, especially with the way that we didn't know some of our tools ahead of time. I think that maybe instead of focusing so much on like characters and settings, if you could focus on like a puzzler and do maybe some cool graphics instead of trying to work on animations, I think it might be more successful. Something like the Jewel looks really nice, but it's not that complicated to produce, so you could save a lot of time for
Do you
doing
think
that.
spiraling might be the right approach?
Spiraling?
Yeah, so like you start off like the graphic artist just do stick figures or, you know, a fixed thing. And then you kind of put that in, you see how that looks and how it feels, and then you replace that 5-step or 6-step animation sequence, which is like a stupid stick figure, with your nice looking bird, right? So that you always have a product,
Yeah.
where you are in the, you know, development cycle.
I think in the past, the way that we've dealt with that is that like Jeremy will just do crappy stick figures in MS Paint and he'll put it in. I know we have lots of really amusing stuff on our Greywater blog about programmer art. It is pretty funny because he is not an artist and we don't ask him to be. But having something in place would probably be better. I think you were working with just some squares and stuff when you were working on the physics.
Yeah, Box 2D has, and this actually is almost to our detriment. Box 2D will allow you to turn on, like, just, it'll draw the outline of whatever physics objects you have, whatever bounding boxes for debugging, which is handy. But, you know, in the past, and this is especially for the dev blog requirement of Heartland's code jam, programmer art and like process screenshots are really useful to maintaining that sort of dev blog. So like when we were doing Greywater, because our assets were fairly complicated, our art assets were fairly complicated, and I couldn't just wait for them to finish, you know, all something like 108 frames for any given character. I would, like when I was testing out an attack animation, I just drew like, it was like a sword swinging, but because I needed to be able to tell what frame the sword was, it was sort of emitting fireworks that changed color. It would look awful. It was a master class in badness. But it was really useful for the purpose because I could tell, you know, where I was in the animation. I could make sure that like my sprite functions were working properly. I could make sure that I wasn't ever getting mixed up in state. When you have all of these, you know, just abysmally bad art assets that the programmer has pumped out so that he can get past whatever thing that he's working on, and then you can show them side by side with the finished assets that replaces them, that makes for really good dev blog fodder. Because it's sort of interesting, it's always interesting to see, you know, this is what it used to look like and this is what it looks like now that it's done, and it's even better when you can mock the programmer, because not only is he bad at being an artist, he's just bad at MS Paint. So, you know, you get like a good array of programmer built up, which actually helps keep things moving, it helps keep the dev blog moving, and this is something that we really failed at for our game jam, taking screenshots of, you know, of whoever's got, you know, Illustrator or Photoshop open or GIMP or whatever, taking screenshots just while you're working, and you can see, like, we've got somewhere screenshots of the bird in mid-development, you know, when it was just some color smears, and then it was some color smears with circles drawn around it. We've got those screenshots, we just never did anything with them, because again, we were not super great at communicating, so someone would take the screenshots and then no one would do anything with them. And the dev blog, we had planned on using it to sort of break up the monotony, because at a certain point, you know, when you're drawing the 15th frame of a bird animation, it becomes really hard to keep focused, and so it can be nice to take a break and post these process screenshots, and that because, you know, that's quite a bit more, that's basically web browsing at that point. You don't get to go to Reddit or whatever, but you have to stop thinking about the hard work and instead caption these photos of programmer art and very tired people, and that helps to make the real slog of a code jam less terrible. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about?
I guess we can mention real quickly some things that we think might work
Okay.
well in a game jam. You mentioned earlier that like a first-person shooter is probably not the most valid type of game to try to make.
Yeah.
It's a little ambitious. We think that like simple platformers, side scrollers, puzzle games, and like roguelikes could be pretty effective. If you're comfortable in 3D, I guess you could try doing something in 3D. We are not.
Yeah.
We don't have that experience.
I warn against 3D almost out of principle. There's so many terrible games on Steam Greenlight that's just like baby's first Unreal 3D project, and they imported a gun model and they're like, I made a game, I should sell it for $30 or whatever. And it gets really tempting when you see, you know, when you can navigate a 3D world, which Unreal allows you to do really simply. It feels like a game to you because you made the thing, but it's not, you know, the baby's first Unreal 3D projects aren't fun, they're not really playable, and it's easy to get distracted by something that functions and forget that it needs to be a playable game. So I would say, even if you're comfortable in 3D, probably for the purposes of a code jam, it's probably not the best way to go, because creating 3D assets is expensive and creating 3D gameplay is harder, and it's too easy to make a terrible Steam Greenlight game.
Okay, and I guess one thing that we did do right is when we were brainstorming ideas for just concepts of the game, we didn't go with the very first idea that we had,
Yeah.
because we did realize that it was a little bit too ambitious. We had, I think we had talked about, since it was alone, you were supposed to be a person in an abandoned house, and you were going to be like fighting off bad memories or something like that.
Yeah, there was some...
It's a really cool concept, but we're like, we can't make this. We can't do like human characters
Right.
in this short of a time span. So that's where we moved to like this bird and this bird down the forest. That would be pretty simple.
Right.
Let's see.
Oh, so he was sort of talking about this, whenever possible, you know, if you can, and it's always about, especially in time crunches, offloading work as much as possible. If you can get good, there are good resources to be had on like OpenGameArt, I think .org, and Freesound. There's a lot of stuff out there that, you know, you don't need to, for a code jam especially, you don't need to make your own footstep noise. No one's really going to notice it. Grass sounds like grass crunching. There's not that much uniqueness per blade of grass. So if you can find someone else's public domain grass crunching noise, use that and let your sound designer work on something more interesting, like the theme music, instead of grass crunching or you know, simple collision noises. As much of that stuff that you can use, because other people have put that stuff out there for you to use. They've given, you know, really permissive licenses, frequently no license at all, just public domain access, and that